An old friend of mine, a Scotsman, tells a story about his first week as a trainee reporter straight out of school. He was told by a grizzled, gnarled old soak of a news editor that to get on in journalism he needed to take up two things: to drink and to smoke. Why? So he might then go to local pubs and pick up stories, winning the confidence of strangers with the offer of a beer or a cigarette. His modern equivalent would not be offered, obviously, that advice for lots of reasons, not least that journalists now rarely leave the office. Newspapers have no money, reporters generally sit chained to their desk and rewrite press releases. And a staple of those press releases is the survey. Businesses and charities and campaign groups now commission more surveys than ever before. It's big business. As newspapers have shrunk, polling companies have mushroomed, we are a nation now market research to within an inch of our lives. It's hard, for instance, to buy anything online without being asked to rate our experience. But the paradox is that a lot of polling is not just rubbish but self-serving. It tells the people who pay for surveys what they already know or what their clients want to hear. But there is one survey which I would dearly love to see commissioned. Its results would, I think, amount to a revelation. The poll I would like to see carried out is this. I want to ask illegal migrants, why they really come to Britain. Not what the NGOs or Green Party assert is the reason they come here, fleeing persecution, climate emergencies, famine, you know the drill. But what truly drives them to borrow money and aim themselves at a country they have no lawful right to enter. It'd be hard, impossible maybe, to carry out such a survey, not least because illegal migrants have the opposite of a duty of candour. Our asylum system rewards evasion, obfuscation and lies. Illegal migrants sometimes pretend to be children or gay or Christian to claim victim status and ultimately claim a passport. But let's imagine that we could collect a sufficiently large sample size of illegal migrants prepared to be totally frank about why they really wanted to move here. The majority, I think, who knows, would be driven by the desire to improve their financial circumstances for themselves, for kith and kin back where they come from, and for the children many intend to have as quickly as possible to anchor themselves permanently in their new home and whose upbringing, to a great extent, we will fund. Some would be motivated by less lofty aims, criminals fleeing not persecution but the none too tender embrace of their own criminal justice system. Others might be driven by ideology, most obviously Islamism, but potentially the interests of foreign states keen to create a network of fifth columnists in the UK. That might sound conspiratorial, but anyone who thinks that the Chinese Communist Party or the Iranian Revolutionary Guard or the Russian FSB haven't sent agents to Britain under the cover of refugee flows is living in cloud cuckoo land. In reality, motives are likely to be mixed. Someone, say, from Iraq, on a small boat crossing the English Channel, may want to set up a small kebab or barber shop. They may not care all that much about its legality in the tax bill. They may feel, as a side benefit, that they will be performing a religious duty by adding to Britain's swelling Muslim population, and they may think by sending remittances home, they're being patriotic too. But what I think such a survey would also reveal is that the vast majority of those seeking to come here feel they sort of know what to expect when they get here. This is a relatively new migratory phenomenon, no older, in fact, than Wi-Fi. Because whether someone is from Bangladesh or Burundi, a vision of Britain will already have been fashioned from what has been seen of it online. FaceTime and Zoom calls with relatives who are already part of the diaspora migrants want to join, but all the other stuff too, the Premier League football footage, the TikTok music videos, the pornography, all of it will make Britain seem like a very different and perhaps far less repressive place to what they're used to. So my survey, my fantasy survey, since it's never going to happen, would establish what really draws illegal migrants to Britain. But it wouldn't end there. There would be a second part to this poll. Not why they first wanted to come here, but what they made of it later, once they've settled and avoided deportation, which the vast majority succeed in doing. What do they make of our country then? Are they impressed? Is it not what they expected? What strikes them as odd? How much do they want to change and make things more like the country they actually left behind? What would it take to induce them to leave? There is no one type of illegal migrant, but there are two main categories, I would say. The ones who fit in, work, pay their taxes, don't attempt to stab the natives to death, and then there are those who are, to varying degrees, bad faith actors, and it's these migrants, not the ones who end up making a decent fist of assimilation, who we need to make our focus group, because they're the ones we need to worry about. They're the ones we need to stop getting here or staying here. And I have a feeling that it would be while chatting companionably to this second group over Arabic coffee or Asian sweets that a consensus would emerge, and it would be one partly informed, perhaps, by what they had seen online before coming to the UK, but also what they'd witnessed since getting here. What would that overarching impression be? Let me start by saying what it wouldn't be. It wouldn't be an impression couched in the language of HR or the university campus or a press release from West Yorkshire Police. It would be an assessment many of us would find crude or crass and old-fashioned. But just because these migrant observations would strike many of us as primitive doesn't mean it's not what they think. And if I had to guess what I think this consensus would be, is this. That you people, we in Britain, the British, are a fallen people. A fallen people. We are not the civilization we were. We are a corrupted, depleted version of something once world-bestriding. Our cultural self-confidence is shattered, our morals scattered, our very survival as a race doubtful. People who come from countries, materially backward countries, would be astonished at our nihilism, our lack of certainty about the most obvious things, at least obvious to them, what it is to be a man or a woman, whether or not to have children, how to look after old folk, whether to believe in God. They would see us, I repeat, as a fallen people. This goes far beyond just what illegal migrants make of us. One of the great flaws with the whole misguided multicultural experiment has been a vaulting incuriosity about what mental and cultural baggage new arrivals bring with them. If you take my home city of Bradford, the assumption was that the moment Pakistanis set foot in Yorkshire, originally to work in the textile mills, they would bring nothing from their native land other than the clothes they came in. The assumption was that they would abandon all the cultural and religious and kinship practices that shaped them. It's a level of naivety, the consequences of which we live with still. In Pakistan, for instance, the proportion of people who pay income tax is about 1.5% of the population. Was that mindset left totally behind the moment Pakistanis arrived in Bradford? We know that some practices, if I can use such a dignified word to describe something so squalid, were definitely not quietly dropped. Bradford, for example, has Britain's highest rates of birth abnormalities, something we all end up paying for, because the Kashmiri custom of marrying your cousin is alive and well in Yorkshire. We British used to be very good at looking at the world through the eyes of foreigners. We were very shrewd anthropologists. This will seem strange to many people who imagine the opposite to be true, but the British Empire, a subject we are only meant to feel shame about now, produced a steady stream of imperial administrators whose gift was a deep inquisitiveness about what made the locals tick. This wasn't out of some liberal desire to do good and be empathetic. If you understood subject peoples, you were more likely to be able to dominate them. Some of these colonialists so enthusiastically adopted the local mindset that they were deemed to have gone native. But most pulled off a trick where they could immerse themselves in the language and inclinations of indigenous peoples whilst retaining a belief in the superiority of their own British values. Those days are long gone. We now have cultural relativism, the idea that all cultures are equally valid. It's a disease of the mind, allowing us to overlook things like endemic corruption or abuse of women because the people doing it don't look like us, don't come from where we come from originally. People on the right, like me, have tended to think cultural relativism is the problem. We've argued that we need to stop treating all cultures the same, start discriminating between good cultures and bad cultures, recover the sort of cultural self-confidence that once allowed Britain to bestride the world and export our governance, law, language, dress, sport, you name it, and all will be well. But this misses a really important point. It overlooks the other thing those long-dead British imperialists did, the profound thirst they had, the determination to understand, which they possessed, the thing that made them infinitely better than their European counterparts, the French, the Spanish, the Germans, or heaven forfend, the Belgians. And that British advantage was our curiosity, the gift we had for seeing things the way locals saw things. The past, as they say, is another country. They do things differently there. And it's certainly true that the men who forged the largest empire the world had ever seen would take a pretty dim view of our inability to stop the boats crossing the channel carrying passengers about whom we know nothing. But I think in some ways they would show us that we were the ones acting in an obsolete way. They would see our utter unwillingness to ask searching questions about what really motivates tens of thousands of fighting-age men to come to Britain illegally as completely baffling and credulous and stupid. So just for 5 minutes, let's try and do what our Victorian forebears would have done without thinking twice, and try to get inside the minds of the men who are coming here on boats, in lorries, or as we now realise, across the Irish border. In the absence of actual polling, this is obviously conjecture, but I think it's a useful thought experiment. Not because I want to stir up hatred of illegal migrants, but because I think we need a paradigm shift in our understanding of the pull factors that make them want to be here. The first thing to say is that many of the migrants who come to Britain do not end up living in its most salubrious suburbs. The black economy of car washes and fast food deliveries, where many illegals end up working, is concentrated in areas of relative poverty, or as are many of the houses in multiple occupation, the HMOs, where many migrants are now warehoused. If all you see of this country is a succession of students ordering takeaways or down-and-outs wanting drugs, you are not seeing Britain at her best. Many of us, certainly many of us of a certain age, look in horror at what formerly respectable areas of urban Britain have become. The dearth of civic pride, the decline in shared codes of dress and behaviour, the Brownian motion of e-scooters and bikes, the once tidy front gardens replaced by an urban hellscape of too many parked cars, wheelie bins and dog shit. But if you come from a fly-blown town of dirt roads and no sewers in sub-Saharan Africa, none of this matters. No matter how much graffiti, no matter how many lifts in your council tower block don't work, it is an improvement on what you had before. However, I can imagine if you've made your way through Libya and across the Mediterranean and then onto a dinghy bound for Britain, when you get here, there are things you really notice, that have nothing to do with appearances. Social care. The idea of importing hundreds of thousands of migrants to look after old British people would seem outlandish if you hail from a country where elders are venerated, and the idea of contracting out their care would be considered immoral. Empty churches. The idea of religion becoming a fringe activity would seem very odd for the vast majority of men who come here on small boats. If you come from a Christian part of Ethiopia or Sudan, you come from a country where the notion of a church being converted into a bar or apartments would be sacrilegious. If you come from a Muslim part of those countries, and many others besides, you might consider bizarre the widespread abandonment in Britain of an Abrahamic religion like Christianity. And if a new arrival on a small boat would find Britain's godlessness shocking, what would they make of our inability to say what a man or a woman is? In their local GP surgery, would they applaud the poster pictures of chest-feeding pregnant people, complete with beards? I recently went for a medical appointment and was met by a man who may have been a woman. I don't know, and I don't particularly care. They were efficient, sent me where I needed to go. But I wonder what impression he, she, they, them would have made on someone who last month was living in a camp near Calais. Some people will say none of this matters. A healthy society can accommodate difference. We can teach the most wayward of illegal migrants to adopt our mores, no matter how traumatised they've been by their previous lives. We can change their attitudes to dumping litter or spitting in public or harassing schoolgirls. But how much confidence can we have in the British state to impose compromise on people who couldn't even be trusted to move here legally? Will these illegal migrants jettison being judgmental because we tell them to be kind? In time, will these hard men with hard edges start to change us more than we change them? I was in central London recently watching a couple pushing a dog in a pram past a group of young men who I suspect were not long in the country. They seemed to find the spectacle comical, ludicrous. Perhaps they thought what they saw, a fur baby in a buggy, was a symbol of Western decadence and moral collapse, and honestly, they might have a point. I accept a few of the dogs who find their way into strollers, as a growing number do, might have health problems, a touch of arthritis, but some are clearly child substitutes. If you come from a culture where the clan is all, the family the foundation of everything, and children the source of hope for the future, the idea of a dog being treated like a child is beyond belief. It is the mark of a fallen people. We don't need a poll to tell us that. I don't want to get all Edward Gibbon fall of the Roman Empire about this. Britain is not Babylon. There are plenty of people who can trace their Britishness back centuries, who are just as likely to look askance at a church that's been boarded up or a dog that's been wrapped up as someone who's just landed on these shores courtesy of a ride from the Coast Guard. But the divergence in everyday values is really often quite profound. Many of the men who are coming here illegally, quite a few who are here legally, are unlikely to hold liberal values on gender, environmentalism or blasphemy, to name but three. And though they may scoff at the sight of a dog in a buggy, they also see that a society which no longer wants to replicate itself, which prefers to see parenting as a suboptimal lifestyle choice, is not one that has a lot of road in front of it. Fallen. And I think we're already beginning to see how this plays out, that absurd tactical alliance that currently exists under the banner of the Green Party. For instance, between left-wingers, a fair few of whom I suspect prefer chihuahuas to children, and Gaza activists cannot last forever. The latter tend to be socially conservative, the former the opposite. The only thing that seems to unite them is a hatred of Israel. They are environmentalists in name only, increasingly pandering to sectarianism. If ever a pact was destined to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions, then this one will. And I imagine that what is left afterwards is a movement that is less liberal, more assertive, more Islamist adjacent than what went before. My concerns, let me be clear, are not about those legal migrants who come to the UK, who often work hard and fit in and aim to be essentially like us. Rather, I am anxious about what reforms say is at least 1 million people living in the UK right now, illegally, with tens of thousands more arriving each year. Their impact will be felt beyond politics. It will be there on the streets, on what is stigmatised or tolerated at street level. A lot will depend on where you live. In areas of high migration, I predict it will become less likely, for example, for pride events to be celebrated with enthusiasm. And what is disappointing to me, again, is the lack of curiosity. As I say, I know the idea of polling companies trying to get into the minds of migrants is pie in the sky, but I wonder if you can see why it matters. I was in Newcastle recently and in a town just across the Scottish border, and in both places I saw groups of bored-looking young men meandering around, presumably heading to a migrant hotel, maybe hostel, a house. We prefer not to walk in their shoes or see through their eyes. We pronounce on what they are, what they stand for, what they aspire to, without really knowing. The extreme left think they're all victims of war and climate change, just waiting to become the next generation of brain surgeons. Parts of the right see only sexual deviants bent on predation, exploitation and conquest. Neither side really knows, though I fear the left is much wronger than the right. I know there'll be those who find my suggestion that our median level of scepticism and curiosity is not what it was a century and more ago. The idea that somehow Victorian men in whiskers and starched collars were more curious about foreigners than we are today. That's what I believe. As a younger man, I remember talking to an octogenarian who had served as a civil servant for the colonial office in Africa. He spoke several native languages and maintained a deep respect for local cultural practices, but he also thought those same practices had no place in Britain. It seems to me now, because the world has opened up through travel and the internet, that many of us think of ourselves, by comparison with our ancestors, as cosmopolitan and worldly wise. But worldly is a state of mind, not a series of stamps in our passport. I think we are less worldly than we have ever been, less curious about the realities of human nature than we have ever been, particularly if the humans concerned are not from round these parts. We congratulate ourselves on being open-minded, while forgetting that it's possible to be so open-minded that our brains fall out. Bye for now. At Outpost, we are committed to free speech and shining a light on untold stories that matter. To support our documentaries, reports and podcasts, please like, share and subscribe to our work on Substack, YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Thank you.